Welcome back to the fifth installation of us reviewing backfield trends for backfields that are a little bit ambiguous or just confounding altogether. We begin for a fifth straight week with the Pittsburgh Steelers. In this game, Najee Harris was the only regular running back that played. Cordero Patterson and Jalen Warren missed this game. Najee predictably led the backfield with 14 carries. However, he only had 42 rushing yards, averaging 3 per carry with a long of 6. No rushing touchdown for him. It's interesting that two other running backs were utilized in this game, Aaron Shamklin and Jonathan Ward. Aaron Shamklin had 4 carries for 14 yards, an average of 3.5 with a long of 5 and no touchdown. And Jonathan Ward had 2 carries for 9 yards, 0 touchdowns with a long of 6. Through the air, Najee Harris was the only running back that did anything. He was actually their leading receiver, which is pretty sad. On 2 targets, he finished, however, with 2 receptions for 35 receiving yards and no touchdown. And so while Najee Harris wasn't very efficient on the ground, he was incredibly efficient through the air. For every other backfield, I'm going to compile averages for weeks 1 through 4 in terms of target share, rush share, and snap share in general, and then look at week 5. In this case, because I would have to chart out a total of 5 running backs and it just wouldn't fit on the screen, I'm only going to take a look at Najee Harris versus Aaron Shamklin and Jonathan Ward. And so I wanted to see Najee Harris's output when he was really the only starting level running back playing, and you have to be pretty happy in terms of the usage. He played 74% of the snaps as opposed to Aaron Shamklin's 19% and Jonathan Ward's 5%. When we look at his rush share, his 53.85% easily led the backfield. Aaron Shamklin had 15.38%, and Jonathan Ward had 7.69%. And through the air, he was the only running back targeted, and once again was their leading receiver, and he had 7.69% of the target share. And so while it was a really inefficient game for Najee on the ground, I think better days are ahead. And in the event that this kind of game repeats, where he's really the only starting level running back playing for them, I think we can have a much better expectation in terms of his potential output for us in fantasy. And so while he didn't get, 90% of the rush attempts, he did get all of the receiving work in terms of running back targets, and he still had over 50% of the rush share, and so you have to be pretty happy with that, even if the fantasy results due to efficiency and lack of touchdown scoring kind of capped the weekly ceiling that we saw this past week. Next, we move to the Vikings backfield. This game was a little bit different. Aaron Jones did leave with a hip injury. The Vikings, however, have a week 6 bye, so there's a decent chance, it looks like from reports, that he'll be back for week 7. He's considered week to week. And so these stats are a little bit misleading if you don't contextualize them. But it is good news that if you're a Ty Chandler owner and Aaron Jones goes down, that he should see a much bigger workload and especially snap share. In this game, Ty Chandler wasn't very efficient. They were playing the Jets though, so not an easy matchup. He had 14 attempts for 30 rushing yards, averaging only 2.1 per carry with a long of 5. Aaron Jones, however, was faring much better. He had 7 carries for 29 yards, averaging 4.1 per carry with a long of 9. CJ Ham, I didn't include in this because he's technically a fullback, and he wouldn't really see, in my opinion, the rushing share that if Aaron Jones and Ty Chandler went down, that Myles Gaskin would. And so Myles Gaskin was pretty inefficient, but he only touched the ball 2 times on the ground, 2 carries for 2 yards with a long of 2 and no touchdown. Through the air, Ty Chandler still only had 2 targets despite Aaron Jones missing most of the game. He had 2 receptions for 9 yards on those 2 targets with no touchdown. Aaron Jones was really efficient on his 1 target. He had 1 reception for 24 receiving yards. When we take a look at the average snap, rush, and target shares through weeks 1 to 4, it's easily Aaron Jones' backfield. He plays 65% of the snaps, Ty Chandler plays 29%, and Myles Gaskin sits at 1%. When we take a look at the rush shares from weeks 1 to 4, Aaron Jones has 54.67% to Ty Chandler's 26.57%. And when you look at the rush shares, Aaron Jones averages 19.05 through weeks 1 to 4 to Ty Chandler's 4.18%. Despite playing about 1% of the snaps, Myles Gaskin hadn't recorded a rush or a target through weeks 1 to 4. Obviously, when we take a look at week 5, you have to contextualize it with the injury. Aaron Jones only played 22% of the snaps. He did have a 23.33% rush share with a 3.57% target share. More importantly, though, Ty Chandler, in his absence, at least through most of the game, had 63% of the snaps played to Myles Gaskin's 7%, And so he's basically a featured back, it looks like, when Aaron Jones is out. And so what that would lead me to conclude is if Ty Chandler was out, Aaron Jones would more than likely be much more of a featured back, but we don't know that for sure. In Aaron Jones' absence for most of the game, Ty Chandler had 46.67% of the rush attempts to Myles Gaskin's 6.67%, and Ty Chandler had 7.14% of the target share to Myles Gaskin's 3.57%. And so what we can conclude here is even though it was against the Jets, and so the running efficiency probably wasn't close to what it would normally be in an average or advantageous matchup, Ty Chandler does stand to gain a lot of volume in the event of an Aaron Jones injury and does appear as though he would be a mostly featured back. And so I think he's a very, very good handcuff because it appears as though he'll receive a massive percentage of the opportunity. And if you're an Aaron Jones owner, even though he missed most of the game with the hip injury, it is good to see from, at least if you own him only, that Ty Chandler wasn't incredibly efficient. Obviously, if Ty Chandler had a ridiculous game on the ground or something, they might decide to work him in a little bit more. And they still might because of Aaron Jones getting injured, but at least that didn't happen from his standpoint. And Myles Gaskin can probably be left on the waiver wire. It would really take an injury to both of them for him to get any action, at least significant action. And so we'll definitely need to monitor Aaron Jones' availability because should he miss week 7, Ty Chandler, it appears, stands to gain a lot from that. When we take a look at the Cincinnati Bengals backfield, Chase Brown is surging. He had 12 carries for 46 rushing yards. While that was only 3.8 per carry with a long of 16 and no touchdown, that was still much more efficient than Zach Moss. Zach Moss had 9 carries for 24 rushing yards, averaging 2.7 per carry with a long of 8. He also didn't finish with a rushing touchdown. Through the air, however, Zach Moss was still much more efficient. On 4 targets, he finished with 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards. While Chase Brown did get the receiving touchdown, on 3 targets, he still only had 3 receptions for 8 receiving yards. And so touchdowns are a little bit fluky, but it is good if you're a Zach Moss owner to see that he still is much more efficient through the air. However, it's starting to trend as though they're both going to handicap each other's upside and potentially be decent flex plays, it appears at least. When we look at weeks 1 to 4, Zach Moss averaged 70% of the snap share. Chase Brown averaged 30%. When we look at the rush share, Zach Moss had 54.80% to Chase Brown's 30.08%. And when we look at their target shares, Zach Moss had 10.56% to Chase Brown's 7.89%. When we take a look at week 5, Zach Moss's snap percentage dropped just a little bit and Chase Brown's rose just a little bit, but they still remained relatively close to the averages. Zach Moss had 67% to Chase Brown's 33%. But when we look at their rush shares, this is what changed significantly. Zach Moss only had 39.13% to Chase Brown's 52.17%. And this could mean one of two things, in my opinion. It could be a game-to-game thing where they're going to ride the hot hand, or this could be a trend because we've seen through the past 2 weeks Chase Brown be much more efficient on the ground. And so what it could mean is that Chase Brown is starting to permanently eat into the rush share. Through the air, though, Zach Moss still remains much more efficient in general. And so I wouldn't be too worried about Chase Brown happening to score 1 receiving touchdown when Zach Moss was much more efficient through the air. But from an overall fantasy standpoint, I think that you do have to be quite worried if you're a Zach Moss owner. And if you're a Chase Brown owner, you have to be pretty happy. And so before we make any real conclusions, I think we want to see one more week of production. But this backfield is starting to get really, really messy. Now we're looking at the Jacksonville Jaguars backfield, and this one I think really, really matters. Tank Bigsby, in the games in which he's actually played and wasn't injured and either missed or barely played at all, has been way more efficient than Travis Etienne, who himself hasn't even been that inefficient really in most of his games. It's just that with Tank Bigsby being much more efficient, I think if you're an Etienne owner, you really do need to start worrying. Although I don't think he'll be phased out of the receiving game whatsoever. If he is in an even or potentially less than 50% total rush share in general, that makes things really tricky for this backfield. Tank Bigsby finished with 13 carries for 101 rushing yards, averaging 7.8 per carry with 2 touchdowns and a long of 65. He looked decisive. He looked bursty. And on his 19-yard touchdown run, he broke multiple tackles. Travis Etienne only had 6 carries for 17 rushing yards in this one, averaging 2.8 per carry with a long of 4. I wouldn't worry too much about the Travis Etienne part of it in terms of his general efficiency. He's usually much more efficient than he was in this game. He's also been battling injury, which, if you've been an Etienne owner, I'm speaking more so to dynasty players here. If you've noticed, there's been so many times where he gets hurt mid-game but then comes back. And so he is very, very tough. But he does in general have injury concerns, as Tank Bigsby does too, it seems. But man, it is crazy how efficient Tank Bigsby has been this year. And I think we really do have to start worrying that he's going to really eat in and potentially overtake Travis Etienne, at least in terms of the rushing share. Through the air, though, Travis Etienne had 7 targets, including 6 receptions for 43 receiving yards and no touchdown. And so he's still going to be a very, very safe floor running back. I doubt there's too many games, at least in a full PPR setting, where he has less than 10 points. It's just those 26 to 30 point games might never happen again. And Tank Bigsby, this was actually the first target he received on the year. He was very poor through the air and had multiple drops this past season. But to his credit, on the first target, he had 1 reception for 28 receiving yards. And Tank Bigsby coincidentally finished as the RB1 overall in week 5. And yeah, it's very concerning if you're an ETN owner, and if you're a Bigsby owner, I think you have to be really happy. And so I think that Bigsby is a strong hold if you're a fantasy owner, because there's the opportunity for him to be really efficient, start eating into the workload on the ground consistently, and then maybe even earn some targets. And if you're an ETN owner, I definitely wouldn't sell. I don't know what you would even really get for him. I actually sold 2 weeks ago in a dynasty league, and I got a 2027 first for him. I still kept a Bigsby though. And while you generally don't want to predict first multiple years out to be early, the guy doesn't have his 26 first, and his entire team is really old. And so I think it's going to be a top 3 pick for sure. But maybe somebody would still buy for a first, but I really doubt in general that's going to happen anymore. And so if you're an ETN owner, I think in general your best bet is to probably hold, because I don't think you'd get proper value for him. And when we look at the average rush, snap, and target share of the 3 running backs that have played so far, through weeks 1 to 4, Bigsby had 19% of the snap share, Travis Etienne had 66%, and Dearness Johnson had 17%. When we take a look at the rush shares, Tank Bigsby had 21.78%, Etienne had 54.65%, and Dearness Johnson had 10.98%. When we look through the air, though, throughout the first quarter of the season, Bigsby hadn't recorded a target. Travis Etienne had a firm hold on that with an 11.31% target share, and Dearness Johnson was sparingly used. He had a 0.56% target share. And so it was looking in general like Etienne was easily the back to own out of this backfield. And while we still need to have a little bit more time to have a conclusive outcome here, I think Bigsby is making a strong case to take over a lot of the carries. And if, granted, it was only 1 target in the first one he's had, if he's able to be relatively efficient through the air, I think Bigsby could potentially become the more valuable running back. When we take a look at week 5, Bigsby played 40% of the snaps, Etienne played 38%, and Dearness Johnson played 22%. It is important to understand that Etienne was playing through injury, though, and so I think that did have some to do with the snap share. When we look at the rush share, though, Bigsby had 56.52% to Etienne's 26.09%, and Dearness Johnson 4.35%. However, through the air, Etienne actually set a high this season with 20.59% of the targets. Tank Bigsby had 2.94%, and Dearness Johnson had 8.82%. And so once again, I think Travis Etienne, unless you can get a first for him, is generally a good hold, because I don't think you'll get good value for him. Tank Bigsby, I think, is an absolute hold. because I think that there's a real opportunity for him to gain a ton of value and get a lot more usage in this offense. And to Ernest Johnson, if you're in a deep league or, like a 16-man league or something, I think is a good hold because should ETN or Bigsby miss an extended period of time, he has a good bet to get a good amount of usage. It's just the upside with both of them playing, or at least not out for a significant period of time, just isn't that great. Taking a look at Green Bay's backfield, Josh Jacobs led the backfield easily with 19 attempts. He only had 73 rushing yards, though, which was 3.8 per carry. However, he did score a rushing touchdown, so you had to be pretty happy about his fantasy output from that. Emmanuel Wilson was second in the pecking order and really the only running back besides Jacobs we want to look at here. With Marshawn Lloyd not playing again, Emmanuel Wilson is the only other running back that we want to take a look at here. He finished the game with 6 carries for 24 rushing yards, averaging 4.0 per carry with a long of 7. He didn't score on the ground. Through the air, Emmanuel Wilson really didn't offer much. Unless you were in a full point PPR, he lost you points. On his only target, he had 1 reception for -9 receiving yards. Josh Jacobs, on the other hand, while he received the same amount of usage in terms of target share, his 1 target turned into 21 receiving yards. When we take a look at their average snap, rush, and target shares through weeks 1 to 4, Josh Jacobs easily led the backfield with 63% of the snap share. Emmanuel Wilson had 31%. When we look at the rush shares, Josh Jacobs had 54.45% to Emmanuel Wilson's 25.76%. And their target shares was 6.44% for Jacobs to 5.44% for Emmanuel Wilson. In week 5, Josh Jacobs easily beat his average snap share with 75% to his usual 63%. And Emmanuel Wilson went from 31% down to 25%. And the same thing happened with Josh Jacobs' rush share. He had 63.33% to his average of 54.45%. And Emmanuel Wilson had 20% to his average of 25.76%. In week 5, they both had a 4% target share. Nothing crazy there. And so I think that once again, and it's reasonable to assume this is going to be consistent going forward, Josh Jacobs is definitely the running back that you want to have out of this backfield. And Emmanuel Wilson in larger leagues could be a desperation flex play, assuming Jacobs plays. But I think he's a very, very good handcuff to own. And so besides those thoughts, I don't really think there's much else to conclude from the Green Bay Packers backfield. Just like with the Packers backfield, this will be the first week that I'm covering the Rams backfield. And while Kyren Williams at this point is in no danger of losing his starting job, he's performed really well. Blake Corum did start to see a little bit more action in week 5. And so I think this one is worth monitoring just in case this changes. But for now, it's Kyren Williams' backfield. In week 5, he had 22 carries for 102 rushing yards, averaging 4.5 per carry with a touchdown and a long of 30. Blake Corum actually set a season high with 5 rush attempts for 25 rushing yards, averaging 5 per carry with a long of 12. Through the air, both of the running backs had a target. And this is one game, so I wouldn't really pay too much attention to this. But Blake Corum was more efficient technically. On his only target, he had 1 reception for 8 yards versus Kyren Williams' 1 target and 1 reception for 3 yards. When we take a look at their average snap, rush, and target shares through weeks 1 to 4, Kyren Williams easily leads the backfield with 85% to Blake Corum's 4%. In terms of the rush share, he has 75.91% to Blake Corum's 10%. And looking at their target shares, Kyren Williams had 11.82% so far, and Blake Corum hadn't yet registered a target. In week 5, Kyren Williams actually had a 1% snap share higher than his average through the first 4 weeks. And really the only difference is that Blake Corum absolutely took over the backup role. And when we look at the rush share, Kyren Williams outperformed his average with 78.57%. But Blake Corum, to his credit, also massively outperformed his average with 17.86%. And their target shares were the same. In terms of what we can conclude here, it's still Kyren Williams' backfield for now. There really isn't any reason for them to go away from him. He's performing really well generally. This game, he was technically less efficient, but with more volume, you generally get a reduced efficiency. And so I don't think anything really changed too much, except for Blake Corum firmly taking over the backup role. And so I think Kyren Williams is still a very strong start every single week, whereas Blake Corum is really a very high-end backup because should Kyren Williams go down, even for just one game, but especially over an extended period of time, Blake Corum has a ton of weekly upside. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. I go through each and every single week, compile all this data, and then break down what we saw in terms of trends from each one of these backfields from week to week. Think about what we might be able to project for them in the future. And yeah, if you want to see this series continue, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a great and easy way to support the channel. And if there's anyone else you want to see me cover, feel free to comment down below. Thanks. Another new addition is the Giants backfield. I think if you were a Tyrone Tracy owner, you have to be really happy. He had 18 attempts for 129 rushing yards, averaging 7.2 per carry with a long of 27. He didn't score, but yeah, that's a very, very good week. Eric Gray was the only other running back to do anything. He had 4 carries for 4 yards with 1.0 per carry and a long of 2. Really nothing. This was easily the Tyrone Tracy show. When we look through the air, though, Eric Gray was very, very efficient. On 4 targets, he had 3 receptions for 50 yards. Tyrone Tracy, while generally he is a good receiving back, was really inefficient in this one. On 2 targets, he had 1 reception for 1 receiving yard. In general, if Devin Singletary were to miss time, I would much prefer Tyrone Tracy. I think he's the better running back. And I think in general, especially through the air, you're going to see much more efficiency from Tracy. He was a converted wide receiver, for instance. And so when we look at the season averages, it's easily been Devin Singletary's backfield. He's had 71% of the snap share. Tyrone Tracy's played 25%, and Eric Gray's played 5%. When you look at the rush share through weeks 1 to 4, Devin Singletary has 57.17%, Tracy has 11.59%, and Eric Gray has 4.21%. When you look at the average target share, Eric Gray has 0.66%, Tyrone Tracy has 4.14%, and Devin Singletary has 7.9%. In week 5, Devin Singletary missed a game with an injury, so he's, in general, I think still going to lead the backfield, but with Tyrone Tracy performing really, really well, I think this is a backfield where we could see potentially him starting to eat into Devin Singletary's share. In Singletary's absence, Tracy played 63% of the snaps to Eric Gray's 36%. He recorded 52.94% of the rushes to Eric Gray's 11.76%. And through the air, he had 6.45% of the target share to Eric Gray's 12.9%. If you're a Devin Singletary owner, I do think you have to worry about this potentially starting to turn into a timeshare. I don't think he'll be outright replaced because they paid him a contract. And so I think he, this year and next year, is basically guaranteed to be on the team, and they're not going to pay him to not use him. But there is the chance that he really isn't going to have the workload that he had at the beginning of the season, given this performance, and especially if he's able to anywhere remotely close to repeat what he's shown in week 5. If you're a Tyrone Tracy owner, you're obviously ecstatic. I wouldn't expect when Singletary comes back for him to have nearly this level of a workload, but he looked really good, and should Singletary miss an extended period of time, there is a ton of upside. And if you're an Eric Gray owner, you really do need one of them to be injured at any given time for him to have any value. But if both were to miss time, I think Eric Gray would be a fantastic plug-and-play option. Moving on to the Dolphins backfield. Before the season, I was really high on Jalen Wright. I tried to draft him everywhere I could in Dynasty. In redraft, I wasn't really too concerned because he would need 2 injuries this season to really get any action. However, it was a decent bet given that it was Mostert and A-Chain ahead of him. Despite having 6 less carries, he actually had the most rushing yards. He finished with 13 carries for 86 rushing yards, averaging 6.6 per carry with a long of 17. He didn't score a touchdown, but still a very, very good game. Raheem Mostert finished with 19 carries, 80 rushing yards, averaging a respectable 4.2 per carry with a long of 18. He also didn't score a touchdown. Devon A-Chain did only finish with 3 carries, but he left with a concussion. He did have 18 rushing yards, though, so that was 6.0 per carry with a long of 12. When we look at the receiving work, Devon A-Chain, despite only playing 14% of the snaps, did finish with a target. However, he lost a yard on his only reception. Jalen Wright didn't receive a target in this game, but Raheem Mostert had 2, and he went 2 for 18, so really efficient there. This backfield's pretty interesting. When we take a look at the season averages for rush, target, and snap shares, Jeff Wilson played 14% of the snaps, A-Chain's played 66%, Mostert's played 11%, and Jalen Wright's played 23%. When you take a look at the rush shares, Jeff Wilson's had 9.17%, A-Chain's had 49.76%, Mostert's had 6%, and Jalen Wright's had 13.49%. When we take a look at the Week 5 snap, rush, and target share, Jeff Wilson didn't play. A-Chain had 14% of the snap share before he left with an injury. He had 7.73% of the carries and 3.23% of the target share. Raheem Mostert played 56% of the snaps. He had 46.34% of the rush share with 6.45% of the target share. And Jalen Wright played 32% of the snaps. He finished with 31.71% of the rush share. However, he failed to record a target. In general, I think that Devon A-Chain is a strong hold. When Tua gets back, this offense should go back to being an elite offense. I think that the efficiency for A-Chain is going to go way up. It suffered the last couple of weeks before he left with injury in this game. I think he's going to be a must-start as soon as Tua's back. As far as Raheem Mostert, I think that he's a decent flex play or bye-week fill-in for at least this season. However, I think that Jalen Wright absolutely overtakes him this next year. And as far as Jalen Wright's concerned, I think that he's a strong hold if you're in Dynasty, obviously. He has a ton of upside should A-Chain or Mostert miss a significant amount of time. This game is only the beginning for Dynasty purposes. As for redraft purposes, if your benches are big enough, then he's a good hold, but he's probably not going to be doing it too much if both of the starters ahead of him are healthy. And Jeff Wilson, unless you were in a say 16-man league with deep benches, probably isn't worth much. But yeah, in general, A-Chain's a strong hold. Mostert, if you could sell him for anything, or if you're contending, I think he's a decent play as a bye-week fill-in or flex play. And with Jalen Wright in Dynasty, I would try to get him everywhere you can. It may be too late, but he is going to have a ton of upside as soon as this next season, or really as long as either one of the two starters ahead of him are injured. Moving on to the Raiders' backfield, this one was especially interesting. Amir Abdullah led the backfield despite only having 5 carries. He had 42 rushing yards, averaging 8.4 per carry and a touchdown with a long of 40. Alexander Mattison really was more of a bell cow in this in terms of the rushing share at the very least. He had 15 carries. However, that only turned into 38 rushing yards with no touchdown and a long of 8. And no other running back did anything on the ground. Through the air, Madison was very efficient. His 3 targets turned into 2 receptions for 23 receiving yards. Amir Abdullah was quite inefficient. His 3 targets turned into 3 receptions for only 9 receiving yards. It is worth mentioning that Zamir White missed the game due to injury. But to be fair, Zamir White has been trending downwards. Madison in general has been trending upwards. And Amir Abdullah, at least this past week, was really good. Looking at the season averages through weeks 1 to 4, Zamir White's led the backfield with 46% of the snap share. Madison's been second with 41%, and Amir Abdullah's had 12%. Looking at the season rush share averages through weeks 1 to 4, Zamir White had 58.27% of the rush share, Madison had 20.56%, and Amir Abdullah had 2.94%. Looking at the average target shares, Zamir White's had 5.38%, Madison's had 7.65%, and Amir Abdullah's had 2.67%. It was quite interesting in week 5 to see what the backfield would look like should Zamir White miss a game. In his absence, Madison was still in a committee, but he obviously led the share of the committee with 57% of the snap share to Amir Abdullah's 44%. It did end up with Amir Abdullah being a better fantasy play on account of him happening to score a rushing touchdown. But at the very least, Madison had 60% of the rushes, so that's very good. He's in general been relatively efficient on the ground, so I don't think we should overreact over one poor performance. I mean, if you take away the 40-yard run, Amir Abdullah was 4 for 2 yards, so take that for what you will. Through the air, it was also interesting to see Madison and Amir Abdullah have an even percentage of the target share. What can we expect in the future? I, for one, still think that Madison is the back to own out of this backfield at the very least. I think if you're in a larger league in terms of league size, or in the very least in terms of starting lineup requirements, I think that Madison can be a fine flex play in those kinds of leagues. Zamir White, I would not start him ever really, and Amir Abdullah really needs one of the other two to be injured to have any kind of role, but probably both of them to be injured to have anywhere close to a viable starting role, because I don't expect him to have a 40-yard rush really very often. He's 31 years old. So I think that Madison is still the back to own here, but If you can avoid them every week, I would. It's just if you have to play one of them, I think Madison's the best bet. All right, so moving on to the Buccaneers backfield. This is the second straight inverse game we've had from Rachaad White, where he's been incredible on the ground and very poor through the air. Generally, throughout his career, he's been an amazing receiving back, but by far, at least definitely among the worst rushers of the football. So for a second straight week, he was incredible on the ground. His 10 carries turned into 72 rushing yards with a long of 56. Bucky Irving went 9 for 44, averaging 4.9 per pop with a long of 16. There were no other running backs that recorded a rush in this game. Sean Tucker didn't record a rush or play a snap in this game. When we look at the receiving work, like I mentioned, Rachaad White was incredibly inefficient. On his 3 targets, he had 3 receptions for -6 receiving yards. Very poor. Bucky Irving was decent through the air. His 2 targets turned into 2 receptions for 12 yards. And so, like I said, a very strange game from a Rachaad White perspective. From a Bucky Irving perspective, it's been the norm. He's been pretty efficient with the workload he's been given. When we take a look at the season averages through weeks 1 to 4, Bucky Irving's played 35% of the snaps, Rachaad White's played 69%, and Sean Tucker's played 4%. When we look at the average rush shares, Bucky Irving's been at 39.17%, White's been at 42.75%, and Tucker's been at 2.56%. When we take a look at the average target share, Bucky Irving's been at 5.91%, Rachaad White's been at 12.6%, and Sean Tucker's been at 0.53%. Moving on to week 5, Sean Tucker didn't register a snap, and so he didn't have a rush or target either. When we look at the snap percentage, Bucky Irving's trending up. He's gone from an average of 35% up to 43% this past week. Rachaad White's gone from 69% down to 64% this past week. When we look at the rush share, on average, Bucky Irving's had 39.17%. In this game, he had 34.62%. Rachaad White's averaged 42.75%, and he's gone down to 38.46%. And so it appears as though Bucky Irving is narrowing the gap on the ground. Through the air, Rachaad White is generally still going to be the better back, but for a second straight week, he hasn't been very efficient through the air either. He still has an advantage over Bucky Irving in that regard, given his 12.50% target share to Bucky Irving's 8.33%. And so what can we conclude here? Well, for a second straight week, White was very efficient on the ground with a long run in each one of the past 2 games. Bucky Irving's just been incredibly consistent with his carries, very efficient as well. Bucky Irving's been more efficient the past 2 weeks through the air, to Rachaad White being very inefficient. I think things return to the norm where Rachaad White isn't going to have a long run every week, so I think he's going to return to being quite less efficient in general to Bucky Irving. In terms of Bucky Irving, I think you have to be really happy. I think he's a stronghold. This week, there's a good chance Rachaad White isn't playing, and so we have a decent opportunity to see what Bucky Irving looks like potentially as, at the very least, the better half of a timeshare. I'm guessing Sean Tucker would probably play. And yeah, we'll definitely have to see how this backfield plays out. As we look at the Broncos backfield, Javonte Williams had a fantastic game. His 13 carries turned into 61 rushing yards with an average of 4.7 and a long of 17. Jaleel McLaughlin was the only other running back to have a carry. His 6 rushes turned into 22 rushing yards with an average of 3.7 and a long of 13. Neither one had a rushing touchdown, but Javonte was definitively more efficient on the ground, as he was through the air. His 6 targets turned into 5 receptions for 50 yards. He was actually the leading receiver in terms of yardage, as well as receptions. Jaleel McLaughlin was quite inefficient, but he did score a receiving touchdown. His 4 targets turned into 3 receptions for 3 yards. You have to be pretty happy if you're a Javonte owner. If you're a Jaleel McLaughlin owner, you got bailed out by the receiving touchdown. In general, this backfield isn't a void for me, but Javonte, to his credit, has looked better recently. Even on film, he looks much more decisive. He looks especially more bursty through the hole. Jaleel McLaughlin on the season has played 31% of the snaps. Javonte's played 56%. Estime's played 1%. He's been on IR. And Beatty's played 8%. When we look at the average rush shares, McLaughlin's been at 26.41%. Javonte's been at 42.56%. Estime's been at 2%. And Beatty's been at 10.41%. When we take a look at the target shares through weeks 1 to 4, McLaughlin's had 5.91%, Javante's had 12.6%, Estime's had 0.53%, and Beatty hasn't recorded a target. In week 5, neither Estime nor Beatty played a snap, and so this was strictly the McLaughlin and Williams show. But to be fair, it was really just the Williams show. Williams played 63% of the snaps. That's higher than his average through weeks 1 to 4. Although, to be fair, McLaughlin also played 37% of the snaps, which was also higher than his 31% average. When we take a look at the rush shares, Javonte Williams outperformed his average with 46.43% to his average of 42.56%. And then McLaughlin did dip a little bit. He had 21.43% to his average of 26.41%. Looking through the air, this was one of those games where they really took advantage of or at least tried to take advantage of the running backs in the passing game. Javonte Williams had a ludicrous 23.08% target share, and McLaughlin, in his own right, had a good one as well with 15.38%. Now, what can we conclude? Well, it's looking as though, in general, Javonte is the back to play, although McLaughlin has been getting a good amount of touchdowns this year. At times, he's been efficient. This backfield in general is a little bit wonky. When Estime returns, I think it returns to being a complete mess. Even Beatty, who even knows? At this point, at least, Javonte is the best bet to start. It's just, you'd hope he's your RB4 ideally. If he's your RB3, it is what it is, but I would probably avoid this backfield. But for now, if you have to play one, I think Williams is probably the best bet. The final backfield we're going to take a look at here is the Dallas backfield. Congrats to Rico Dowdle. It appears as though he's definitely leading this backfield. He's gone from being second to Zeke to being definitely the better bet at running back. In this game, he had 20 carries for 87 yards on the ground. That's 4.4 per carry with a long of 13. He didn't score a touchdown, but still a decent night overall. It's especially good if you're an owner to see the volume. Zeke had 6 for 17, 2.8 per carry with a long of 5. Pretty inefficient. No other running back had a carry. Deuce Vaughn didn't play a snap in this one. When we look through the air, Rico Dowdle was incredibly efficient. On 2 targets, he had 2 receptions for 27 receiving yards and a touchdown. So overall, a very good night for him. Zeke did register a target, but he didn't haul it in, so nothing through the air for him. Rico Dowdle has been trending upwards in this backfield each and every single week. On the season, he averages 44% of the snap share. Zeke averages 32%, and Deuce Vaughn averages 8%. In terms of the rush share, Dowdle has 40.79%, Zeke's 27.27%, and Vaughn's 8.89%. And through the air, through weeks 1 to 4, Dowdle leads the backfield with 7.32% of the target share. Zeke has 5.4%, and Vaughn has 1.61%. Taking a look at week 5, Dowdle played 50% of the snaps. That's better than his 44% average, so he's trending upwards. Zeke played 30%, down from his average of 32%. He's been trending downwards each and every week. When we look at the rush share, Dowdle had 64.52%. That is awesome. On the year, he averages 40.79%, but that's been going up recently. Zeke has been going down. He had 19.35% this week to his average of 27.27. And through the air, if you're a Dowdle owner, you have to be pretty happy. His 4.88% doubled Zeke's 2.44%. And so what can we conclude here? Well, this is becoming Rico Dowdle's backfield. He's trending upwards each and every single week. He's delivering as well. And now, while we can't bet on him to score a touchdown every week, if he can get roughly 20 carries and then a couple receptions with a chance to score a touchdown, he's going to become a weekly must start. Zeke's starting to become an afterthought. He's very inefficient on the ground, at least. Through the air, he's been okay. This week, he didn't do anything, but in general, Rico Dowdle is the only guy you want to start. In general, Zeke is trending downwards, and so I think he's eventually going to become droppable. Deuce Vaughn, without 2 injuries, probably isn't going to do much. But Rico Dowdle, if he can keep trending upwards, is going to become a weekly must start, and he has the chance to become a featured back. And while Dallas's offensive line isn't what it once was, having a featured back in the Dallas backfield is pretty valuable, and Dowdle's looked really, really good. All right, so out of all these backfields, I personally think the Jaguars is the most interesting. I'm really curious to see if Tank Bigsby can continue being much more efficient than ETN on the ground, and if he can start to really eat into the workload of ETN on the ground. Through the air, ETN's still been great, so Bigsby, while he did have 28 yards on his only target so far this year, he's probably not going to take too much from ETN there. We may start to see that Bigsby, though, if he can get, a target or two per game and then get the majority of the carries, including goal line work, could potentially be a better start than ETN on a week-to-week basis. I don't think we should overreact for 1 week where he happened to be the RB1 due to having 2 rushing touchdowns. But in general, he's looked really good on the ground, and it's fantastic for him because he looked terrible last year, and he's gone from looking terrible to looking awesome. But what do you think? Which backfield interests you the most? Let me know below in the comment section, and if there's any other backfield you want me to cover, just let me know. With that being said, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, and have a good day.